Moving on, Congressman Markey has recently stated that he doesn't believe it's a good idea to recycle radioactive scrap metals and reintroduce them into consumer products. However, the Department of Energy and primarily Secretary Chu have been pushing for this for quite some time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this idea of taking radioactive nuclear material and throwing it back into a smelter and with some clean iron ore and making less contaminated radioactive nuclear steel that then enters into consumer products, that's been around for years and years and years. You know, I think it's important to examine why we're doing this, why we're proposing doing this. Right now, radioactive material from inside a nuclear plant is not supposed to be melted down and sold as scrap iron. And there's a good reason for that. Obviously, it's radioactive and there are health hazards associated with it. But what the industry has been lobbying for years is to turn a liability, these huge radioactive vessels that are sitting on their property or sitting out on the Idaho desert, to turn these liabilities into assets to sell the scrap metal. So rather than pay someone to take it, they view this opportunity as a chance to get paid to sell it as waste scrap. I don't think...
We're talking about the nuclear waste itself then. We're talking about the metal that's used in the containments and in the structures that's being irradiated from being in contact with the nuclear fuel.
Yes, that's right. We're not talking about selling radioactive waste. We're talking about selling the iron and steel that a nuclear plant is made of, and then shipping that to a smelter where the other iron and steel would be added, and it would get melted down, and the radioactivity from the nuclear stuff would get spread out into other non-radioactive steel.
So this stuff could become pots, and this stuff could become pans or forks, knives, spoons, anything metal in the consumer product line?
Yeah, there's already been cases of radioactive material getting into the consumer product line. There's been a couple in India and China where radioactive cobalt that's used in X-ray sources has gotten into their smelters and been shipped out as consumer products. Bed Bath & Beyond just had some radioactive steel arrive at their plant in the form of tissue boxes to hold tissue paper. And it was only after the stuff actually was in their stores that they discovered that, in fact, their display case was radioactive. So this stuff has snuck into the waste stream already. But what the Secretary of Energy is saying, Secretary Chu, is that he wants to do it routinely. He wants to take a nuclear steam generator, which is highly radioactive, and melt it down and throw in some clean steel and spread out that radiation and then sell it back to you and me in the form of, pots, pans, forks, spoons, or construction material.
Now, I'm not a scientist, but it doesn't sound like a good idea.
There's two problems. One is that any level of radioactivity, regardless of how low, is cancerous. That's from the biological effects of ionizing radiation. But the other part of it is that the history in India and China is that this stuff doesn't get smoothly distributed. So what the Department of Energy wants to believe is that this radiation gets averaged out over a lot more iron and steel. But in fact, what happens is that it remains in lumps. So you may have some steel that's perfectly clean and another one that's considerably hot. And it's almost impossible to get a process that mixes it. Sort of like making chocolate chip cookies. You're going to get cookies and then you're going to get chunks. And those chunks of radiation, it's not clear that they get averaged out in the blender.
So the silverware in my kitchen may be radioactive while the silverware in your kitchen is not, even if they had come from the same batch, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's what happened this week that really brings us to the forefront is that Congressman Markey from Massachusetts issued a press release, and basically he said this is not a good idea. So I agree with Congressman Markey and suggest that the Department of Energy, stop trying to sell radioactive steam generators into the waste stream. We have enough iron as it is. It's not like there's an iron shortage and we need to take all our contaminated nuclear material to make the shortage go away. There's plenty of iron. This is really a ploy by nuclear industry to make some money off of something that historically has been a liability.
So let's just say I did have a radioactive fork. You've talked a lot in the past about the risks from an external exposure of radiation, basically exposure to gamma rays, versus an internal dose of radiation, such as breathing in a hot particle or swallowing a hot particle. In the case of radioactive metals being reintroduced into the consumer product line, is the risk to the public mostly external or internal?
I think that's a great question, and it's both. Of course, there's going to be an external exposure just from having the pot on your countertop or whatever. But let's just say you're cooking with it, and that radiation then leaches out into the water, which then gets into your food. So it goes either way. There's not a lot of data on this because it's never been tried, but and let's hope it never does get tried, because I don't see where it's helping you and me. It's not helping the consumer here to get any radioactive material in their baby spoons. The only persons that it's helping are the nuclear utilities that very much want to get rid of this material. So the upside of this argument is that utilities make some money. The downside is that you and I and our families run the risk of being contaminated.
All right, Arnie, finally today, some news that you're actually involved in. The San Onofre plant has been a topic of concern for quite some time. You've recently filed an affidavit stating that San Onofre should not start up until it's been relicensed. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I'm on a contract with Friends of the Earth, and I was their expert last year who determined that Southern California Edison had taken a lot of shortcuts in the design of these generators that led them to failing. They were supposed to last 40 years, and in fact they lasted 20 months. So in that role, I've been retained, and I've written 4 reports that are on the website. Well, I just wrote an affidavit in support of a legal filing with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So the legal filing is on the website, and also my expert report and another expert from England, a guy named John Large, so that there's 2 expert reports in an affidavit that basically say the same thing, that the San Onofre plant, if it's going to run at all, needs to be relicensed given what we know about all of the shortcuts that they took in rebuilding these steam generators. So we'll post all those filings on the site, my affidavit, Large's affidavit, and the legal complaint, in case anybody's interested in looking at them.
And what would it take for the San Onofre plant to be relicensed?
Years ago, San Onofre made a decision that they didn't want the public to be involved. So they distorted the process and got their plant modifications approved without a public hearing. Had there been a public hearing, all of the right questions likely would have been asked. And it's really likely that the problems at San Onofre would have been identified in 2005 or 2006, so that now we don't have a plant that's so severely damaged it should never run again. So the process should have been a public hearing with the NRC doing a thorough analysis of the license application. And that's all we're asking for now. So we want them to go back to square one and have the public hearing that they tried to avoid in 2006. So in addition to filing this affidavit, I'm going down to Washington, D.C. to meet with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission next Wednesday. That's the 16th. So they've given me almost 2 hours to talk about my concerns on how these steam generators were built. So in the next podcast coming up next week, we'll have some feedback about how that meeting eyeball to eyeball with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission really went down.
And of course, Arnie, that presentation will be recorded and available via our podcast. Well, I guess that about does it for this week. Arnie, thanks so much for coming on again.
Yeah, well, once again, thanks for having me, Kevin. And I'm looking forward to next week when I'll be able to tell the listeners what happened at the NRC meeting.
Well, that about does it for this week's show. You can catch us back here next Sunday and every Sunday for more discussion on what's happening in the world of nuclear news. For the most up-to-date information from Fairewinds, visit www.fairewinds.org. And remember, Fairewinds is spelled F-A-I-R-E-W-I-N-D-S. For Fairewinds Energy Education, I'm Kevin Hurley. Thanks for listening.